From Cartier, first explorer to enter the St. Lawrence, to Confederation, which in 1867 united the British North American provinces, 3¼ centuries passed. Since Confederation, another 3/4 of a century. 400 years building a Canadian nation. 400 years in which the life of the pioneers has been overlaid and largely forgotten. But behind the great cities, away from the smoke and clang of modern life, we can still find a record of the long-ago times in the things people said, the pictures they painted, and the written records they left behind them. The first explorers sailed westward in search of the Indies, the fabulous El Dorado of gold and silver palaces. For centuries, along the caravan routes of Asia, had come riches and spices from the Orient. Now the navigators set out to find a shorter way to this wealth. Columbus, Cabot, Cartier sailed west over the unknown sea. But instead of the legendary islands lying on their route to the Indies, they found the vast solid land blocking their passage. Within lay terra incognita, the uncharted regions where wild beasts and Indians stalked. As the years passed, explorers mapped the mountains, rivers, and great lakes. North America was born. In 1534, Cartier planted the cross on the Bay of Gaspé, but for 75 years, cold and disease prevented lasting settlement. Another 2 generations, however, and the French had conquered the problem of living in the New World. They settled along the Bay of Fundy and in Prince Edward Island, and penetrated far up the St. Lawrence. They drove back the Indians and cleared the forests. They grew grain, built dams, and adapted their European ways of life to the new climate. Before long, they outgrew their early rough shelters in the little forest clearings. In many places there appeared parks, meadows, and fine houses to mark the growth of the new prosperity, and a standard of living approaching that of the countries which the settlers had left behind. Meanwhile, the French fur traders and missionaries were pushing on, and by 1700, Radisson, La Salle, and many nameless voyageurs had swarmed into the middle of the continent, bringing out furs by a long and dangerous route. At the same time, English explorers had sailed round the coast of Labrador into Hudson's Bay, a short route to the fur supply, exploited in 1670 to form the Hudson's Bay Company.
The Governor and Company of Adventurers of England trading into Hudson's Bay.
Down the Saguenay and the Ottawa came the Indians with their beaver pelts, drawing up their canoes each evening at established meeting places, the tourist camps of yesterday. The beaver gave the Indian the key to the white man's wealth, and a rough scale of exchange was established.
A beaver for 3 hatchet heads. A beaver for a large powder horn and 2 small ones. A beaver for ½ a pound of beads.
In turn, the white man learned much from the Indian. The secret of his birch bark canoe, strong for the buffeting of rapids, yet light enough for easy portage. The value of his snowshoes in the deep snow of lake and forest. His woodland lore, his skill at hunting in the unexplored places of the great continent. Even his game of lacrosse. All along the St. Lawrence, colonization was going on. In 1600, the French population was nil. In 1665, it was about 3,000. In 1700, it was about 12,500. By 1750, it had reached 65,000. Still, the St. Lawrence and its tributaries, the only highways of those days, governed the course of settlement. Stretched back from either bank lay the seigneury, which the French seigneur subdivided into grants to the settlers or habitants. When the habitant divided his holding among his numerous sons, each had to have a strip fronting the river, so that a unique pattern of long, narrow farms was formed, each with its section of river for fishing and transport, its level land for farming, and hilly land, sometimes 3 miles from the farmhouse, for cutting wood and getting maple sugar. In a few of these settlements, the fields were like the spokes of a wheel, at the hub of which was the fort. This may be seen today at Charlesbourg, near Quebec. Under this system of holding land, the French multiplied during the 17th and 18th centuries, fortunate in their three great leaders, Talon, Laval, and Frontenac. The two cities of New France grew up very differently. Montreal started as a mission within enclosing walls, but soon became the gateway to the west, capital of the thriving fur trade. Before long, the medieval town was swamped in the modern city. Quebec, growing much more slowly and keeping the character of an old French town, remained for long within its encircling fortifications. The open spaces round its religious houses were to be used for pasturage in case of siege, as can be seen even today. By the middle of the 18th century, while Indians still camped across the river, Quebec had become a flourishing city, a center of government and New France's only seaport. Outpost of France itself, it imitated on a small scale the splendors of Paris. Within its protecting stone walls stood the governor's palace, and here lived also the garrison with its officers, the fashionable ladies, the intendant, and the bishop. At the water's edge, around the busy quays, lived the bulk of Quebec's 8,000 inhabitants, merchants, shopkeepers, and artisans. The church was the heart of each village and seigneury. The priest was friend and counselor to every habitant, and the habitant family learned the virtue of making everything it needed, and cheerfully doing without the things it could not make. The church supported the best craftsmen. Silversmiths made censers and chalices. The best wood carvers were famous throughout New France. Furniture of local design, handcrafts, and gaily colored woven rugs were in every house. With the fall of Quebec, French domination passed away, but the French-Canadian way of life lived on, and still lives to the present day. The French were the first settlers in the maritime provinces, as their narrow fields still show. But after the Acadians were driven out in 1755, the Scots and Germans came in, then New Englanders before the Revolution, and after it no less than 30,000 loyalists. Here were people of pioneer courage and determination, who applied themselves from the beginning to fishing and trade. Their timber trade was to become the greatest on the continent. Down the Aroostook and the Miramichi floated rafts of logs to the sawmills. With the lumber, the maritimers built villages which grew quickly into towns. By 1795, they were surveying their mineral resources and had discovered and mapped
an outburst of the coals.
But above all, they were men of the sea, fishermen and shipbuilders, sailing their blue-nosed schooners far out to the Grand Banks. Many of the loyalists who came to the maritime provinces still maintained close relations across the border. They soon adapted their former ways of life to new surroundings, modeling their houses on New England architecture and bringing most of their silverware and furniture from the States. When crafts developed, they were meant for export rather than for home use, as in Quebec. Towns grew rapidly. Halifax had been founded in 1749. Military engineers laid out a rectangular center around the fortified citadel. Later, speculative builders pushed this grid rapidly outwards into the surrounding country, unhampered by the ancient system of landholding which survived in Quebec. Thus grew Halifax, one of Canada's first gridiron cities. By the beginning of the 19th century, the maritime provinces were firmly established, providing the timbers for Nelson's navy and trading with the West Indies in lumber and livestock. Later on, Victorian styles of architecture were brought in from England, and as winter came on, the wealthy people of the cities would foregather in their fashionable traîneaux and carrioles. In the country, traveler and settler, wrapped in bearskins and buffalo robes, skimmed smoothly and easily over the snow to meet friends or do business in other parts of the country. As the maritimers of the 19th century looked out over their trim cottages and well-pastured fields, they were ready to cast a sentimental eye backwards and romanticize the hardships of Evangeline and the Acadian pioneers.
Somewhat apart from the village and nearer the basin of Minas, Benedict Bellefontaine, the wealthiest farmer of Grand Pré, dwelt on his goodly acres. And with him, directing his household, gentle Evangeline lived, his child and the pride of the village. A sycamore grew by the door with woodbine wreathing around it. Rudely carved was the porch with seats beneath and a footpath. Farther down on the slope of the hill was the well with its moss-grown bucket fastened with iron, and near it a trough for the horses.
The first settlers of present-day Ontario were the Loyalists. Driven from the 13 colonies after the Revolution, they found a home on the banks of the St. Lawrence. In 1783, they put ashore at Cornwall and drew lots for the land, everyone taking an equal chance. They braved hardship and famine to build a new life for themselves, and soon villages sprang up along the shores of lake and river. This is York in 1804. The encroaching forest was gradually pushed back, but for a long time the stumps of trees were a familiar sight on the main street. As the century went on, the face of the country began to change. Church steeples marked the skylines of the early cities. Factory chimneys, their new industrial suburbs.
Toronto, 1837. Toronto, 1854. Toronto, 1870.
By mid-century, the difficult years were in many places over. As communities became better organized, they started to turn from a search for existence to a means of brightening it. Painters began to appear who saw the country with new eyes, its snow, its clear air, its different ways of living. The greatest of these was Cornelius Krieghoff, whose studies of French-Canadian life were really popular in the 50s and 60s. But for the time, bad influences overcame the good. The houses of the rich were no longer based on native traditions, but imitated Greek and Gothic styles. In them stood opulent Victorian ornaments imported from England, where the decay of taste was in full flood. Most renowned of all Ontario's beauties, Niagara Falls afforded a magnificent subject for romantic exaggeration.
The 43rd Light Infantry turns out at the falls. A fashion plate uses the same setting. Monsieur Blondin walks the cataract.
Meanwhile, a great increase of population was taking place, from 250,000 around 1800 to more than 3.5 million in 1871. The population multiplied 14 times in 71 years. After the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, a tide of immigrants flowed in from the British Isles, driven by post-war unemployment and discontent. This tide and those that followed filled in the spaces left by earlier settlement, until before Confederation, Upper Canada had overtaken Lower Canada in density and volume of population. It was a hard life for the immigrant, as early cartoons show. After the hardships of the voyage, he must make his own way in a country of extreme temperatures, a rigorous winter, a tropical summer, and a short season for crops. But from now on, Canada developed rapidly, and its people drew closer together. Industries, especially lumber, had long outgrown their local beginnings. In 1824, the Columbus was launched in Quebec.
The length of this immense vessel is 300 feet. She carries near 4,000 tons of timber on board.
Great wooden caissons went to build the new bridges. Down the St. Lawrence, bound for the far corners of the world, went rafts of logs strong enough to withstand the big rapids. Down the small rapids shot the logs on a timber slide, one of which the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII, descended on his visit to Ottawa. But greater changes were in store. With the coming of the steamship, lake and river transportation became possible, revolutionizing Canada's internal trade by linking together her scattered communities. As ocean-going vessels improved, Samuel Cunard, a Nova Scotian, spanned the Atlantic with his famous line and made possible fast mail services and mass immigration. In 1800, 80 vessels a year put into Quebec. 40 years later, the number was 1,000, and 500 might be seen on the waterfront at one time, with masts and funnels mingled. An impetus was given to the building of canals.
The Rideau Canal, 1828. The Welland Canal, 1829. The Lachine Canal, the Cornwall Canal.
These and others were part of the first St. Lawrence deepening scheme, which in 1848 made a navigable channel from the Great Lakes to the sea. On the heels of the canals came the railways. In 1857, a motley crowd of immigrants waited on the Toronto platform for the train going west. Railways and other agencies were opening land offices throughout Europe. The new steamships carried the settlers overseas, and land companies then helped them to establish themselves. Town sites were developed on Lake Huron and Lake Erie, in the eastern townships and the Maritimes. The Grand Trunk Railway linked Quebec with Montreal, Toronto, and Chicago. Bridges brought in trade from across the border, but also made a new path down into the United States, thereby drawing off the population which was needed to make Canada prosperous and strong. Canada was split into 3 parts. The maritime provinces were isolated by impassable country from Ontario and Quebec, and these provinces in turn had no railroad link with the West and its unlimited prospects of wealth and settlement. Only by uniting her resources could Canada conquer her difficulties. A bridge was needed to span British North America with new communications, to unify it under a central government. That bridge was Confederation.